Hello and welcome to ELA's virtual tour. We are excited to have you here today. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance. While the pandemic prohibits us from giving live tours to groups, we're delighted that you have joined us to explore this garden virtually. Today, I would like to introduce Dan Jaffe Wilder, who will lead us on a virtual tour of Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary. Dan is a horticulturalist, ecologist, plant propagator, photographer, and author. Dan is passionate about ecological horticulture, building both sustainability and wildlife value into every landscape, and the foraging and cultivation of wild edible plants. He is the horticulturalist, propagator, and staff photographer for Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary. Dan is also the co-author of Native Plants for New England Gardens. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Penny. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. This will be a bit of a new experience for me, and I expect for a lot of people. I was a little disappointed at first to find out that we weren't going to be able to do this in person, but I also realized as I started putting this together that there's some actual really good advantages to a virtual tour. First off, we got a lot of people with us today, which I really like, and also I can lie to you all and pretend that all of these plants are in full perfect bloom right now, despite the fact that some of them are about to bloom or just past bloom and so on. As I go through this, I'll try and point out the ones that are a little bit of a divergence from the truth in terms of the picture you're seeing, but for the most part, I really wanted to try and focus on plants that are happening right now here at Norcross, or at least are on the verge of it. So Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, and for that matter, frankly, I was not familiar with Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary until I started working here. We are kind of one of Massachusetts' best-kept secrets. We are a wildlife sanctuary. We've been in business for quite a while now. I should have a date, but I don't have it in my head. We own over 8,000 acres, all included. About 80% of our land holdings are in Massachusetts. The other 20% are in Connecticut. Our goal matches really nicely with my own personal goal, which is really to build habitat. And so within that 8,000 acres, we have a 2,800 acre contiguous piece of land. That's our largest single contiguous piece of land. And at the center of that 2,800 acres is the 75 acres that I manage. Those are the 75 acres that are open to the public. We just reopened yesterday to the public. So if anyone thinks that this virtual tour seems amazing, please come on in and visit us. And don't be too surprised if some of the plants that I'm going to show you today are not actually truly in full bloom just yet. With that in mind, come on, computer, get moving. There we go. I'm going to kind of give you a brief rundown of where we're going today, and then we'll jump right into it. So we're going to start our walk up by my greenhouse with some very dry meadows. Norcross is an extremely eclectic site. We have dry meadows and wet meadows. We have bogs, we have swamps, we have high dry ridge tops. We have a lot of glacially affected kind of landscape characters. And we've got just about everything in between. We've got a floating bog. We've got all sorts of cool stuff. So what we're going to do today is pretty much walk a big loop around some of our kind of, more prominent areas within the 75-acre public area, starting with these dry meadows. In amongst the dry meadows is our native edibles garden. This is the youngest garden at Norcross. This is, the first new garden I installed when I got here. Norcross has a strange historical relationship with lawn. Frankly, we've got way too much of it, and I'm in the process of trying to kill as much of it as I possibly can. So the native edible gardens are now native edible gardens. They were last year a lawn. And there's quite a few spaces that I will kind of point out little pieces of today that are being converted from lawn into something else. From the dry meadows and the edible garden, we will move into our cedar swamp, which is a dark, moist, very, very cool landscape. It's the sort of spot where even in the full bright sunny day, it's dark and damp in there. It's a unique space without a doubt. It's also quite cool, and by that I mean temperature-wise. We've got species growing there that you don't find in most of these areas in terms of kind of this far south. A lot of species in here are ones that you'd see further north. Once we get out of the cedar swamp, we're going to get to one of our wet meadows, a very, very distinctly different meadow from the dry meadows, completely different species. I don't know if there's any overlap whatsoever. We'll then move on over into our pine barrens. So the original founder of the Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary, Arthur Norcross, was a lover of the New Jersey pine barrens. And we have quite a few spaces on the landscape that are kind of a New Jersey pine barrens, New England hybrid, where we've got species that are present either in both places, both New England and the pine barrens, or are specifically pine barren species that he brought up here and put in place. We've also then, so from the pine barrens, we move into our lime cobbles. Lime cobbles are a very constructed landscape. They are areas where there was a lot of dolomitic limestone brought in, so you've got a higher pH soil than would naturally occur right here in our part of Massachusetts. These are the sorts of soils that you might see in the Green Mountains of Vermont, or in Massachusetts. You catch some of this in the Berkshires, the Connecticut River Valley. You get these kind of richer limestone bedrocks. We've got an artificial version of that here where we can grow things like the cypripediums and the tiarellas you see in this picture. Then we move on to our gravel bank. Our gravel bank is exactly what it sounds like. It's an old gravel pit that has since become a garden. So this is full sun, bone dry, blazing hot. It's a gravel pit that we've diverted a stream into and now made into a small pond. So you not only get the full sun of the fact that there's no canopy here, but you also get a lot of reflective sunlight from both the sand and the water. So this is a very unique garden. It's a space that I often find when professionals come for a visit, they want to see the gravel bank because this mimics some of the most difficult planting conditions that New England has to offer, and they can see what's been working for us, what has not, and can kind of lead you towards a good ideas for your own home landscape. So with that in mind, we're going to kind of jump right into things here and then start our walk. We're starting in our dry meadows and native edible gardens. We don't get a lot of visitors here at Norcross. As I said, we are quite a small secret, so this is probably, in fact, I can say this is the only picture you'll actually see people in. I was amazed to actually see humans in our garden, and the parents of these three kids were nice enough to tell me I could just go right ahead and take pictures and put them to use in our education. What you can see behind the kids and all around them is that this area is dominated by little blue stem, Schizocarium scoparium. It is pretty much the glue that holds these kind of dry meadows together. I'd say probably about 85% of the plants in our dry meadows are little blue stem, and then there are various other things that pop up either above or below or in amongst the little blue stem. We have large amounts of Ionactis linearifolia. This is the one that we were calling Aster linearifolius up until just recently. This is the stiff aster. This is one of a number of asters that do quite well in dry soils. Unlike the other ones, what this one really does is it really needs dry soils. This is one where in the past it's a wonderful species, so I've taken it and stuck it in, good garden soils before. And in my dry areas, it'll get maybe somewhere between 8 and probably 16 inches tall. You put this one in good soils, and it's growing 3.5, 4 feet tall, and then just flopping over and rotting away. It needs poor soils. That's where it thrives, and it does very well there. It's got these big showy flowers. Right now it's in bud. I don't yet see any open flowers. They'll be coming a little bit longer later down the line. And unlike most other, herbaceous plants, this one, the foliage turns really wonderful kind of hues of orange and red in the fall. Really quite a beautiful aster and a great choice if you've got sandy, well-drained, kind of, dry conditions. Kind of speckled in amongst all the little blue stem is Solidago nemoralis, the gray goldenrod. You can actually see those kind of red stems are little blue stem in this picture. The nemoralis is really just about the same height as little blue stem, but it's such a vibrant yellow color that it's one that really does pop out, despite the fact that it's kind of also at the same time somewhat hidden. Especially when the winds start moving through these meadows, you get these kind of flashes of yellow that pop up as the grasses part. It's really a cool spot in terms of these sort of species. I'm a big fan of goldenrods. They get a bad rap for being weeds, which is fair for a couple of species, but is by no means true of the entire genus. They also get blamed for hay fever, which they really have nothing to do with other than the fact that they bloom during hay fever season. One of the definitely showiest species of goldenrods is literally the showy goldenrod. This is Solidago speciosa. As you can see, this one really does pop up above the little blue stem. This is easily one of my favorite species. This one's got enough vigor to really hold its own in a much higher competition meadow. These dry meadows are not very high competition. The conditions themselves are the challenge, not the other species pushing against you. So this one really can form some nice big patches in amongst the little blue stem and really shine. But this is one that I also find myself recommending for, richer meadows where competition's very high and you need a plant that can kind of hold its own amongst other things like Joe Pye weeds and ironweeds and bee balms and some of the more vigorous kind of meadow species. So this one grows anywhere from dry to, pretty moist. As long as it's got good sun, it's happy. It's got those large, showy, erect standing goldenrod flowers that are just, I think, absolutely phenomenal. So some of the smaller stuff, you got to kind of go looking for this, but the nice thing about specifically this bird's foot violet and the next plant is that these guys are blooming at a time of year when the meadow is really quite quiet. Right now, these are in fruit, and in fact, most of the fruit is, I've already collected as much seed as I expect to get. There's still a couple more pods coming along. But these guys really show off quite nicely earlier in the season, and trying to find them now is a real challenge. I need to flag them when they're in bloom in order to find them in fruit later on. They've got this wonderful little bird's foot leaf, and where they kind of show up in the later part of the season is right along the edges of the meadows. Our meadows are in many cases surrounded by kind of, just dirt roadways. And so we have a little bit of a kind of a lip on the edge, and you can spot these kind of, colonizing the edge where you can really see that bird's foot leaf quite nicely. But in the middle of the meadow, you've got a lot of, it's, like a needle in the haystack trying to find them right now. Same story goes for the houstonia, which are starting to fruit right now. The flowers are now past. But there are massive amounts of these in our little blue stem meadows. And again, at this time of year, finding them is something that only happens if you flagged them earlier in the year. In the early season, though these would be well hidden by the little blue stem really only starts to grow. It really starts putting on its kind of spurt of growth right about now, maybe a couple weeks before. So these little guys show up quite nicely in the early spring and then just disappear by June time when the meadow's starting to really kind of grow over everything. Okay, so you can actually see behind these kind of pictures here, you can see that little blue stem meadow in back. This is the native edibles garden. As I said, this is the youngest garden. It's a little more mature than this right now, but this is where we started. This is the work in progress. So I took this picture last fall. This is what the garden looks like this year. We are definitely, we kind of joke that we're as much a wildlife refuge as we are just a deer refuge. We have very, very high deer pressure on our site. So everything goes behind a deer fence unless we are planting things that we know are much more deer resistant. And an edible garden clearly is not what I would consider a deer resistant space. So everything went behind our fences here, and we've got these kind of, right now it's a 2-part garden. I'm planning on adding a 3rd part kind of around the corner of where this picture goes. So these 2 are in full sun. I'd like to add a 3rd part to kind of show off some of the native edible shade-loving plants. But for the most part, we're going to just stick with the sun-loving ones today. The ground cover is almost entirely Fragaria virginiana. As I mentioned, I manage 75 acres here at Norcross. So, one gardener in 75 acres is a lot to cover. So I am not building delicate or high maintenance gardens. I need to build gardens that are as close to self-sustaining as possible. That doesn't tend to really jive with typical edible gardens. So in order to try and get closer to a really low maintenance edible garden, what I decided to do was to pretty much dominate the understory with Fragaria virginiana, which is a very strong spreading, absolutely wonderful native strawberry. It's vigorous enough where it doesn't tend to play well with too many other species. So instead of doing a lot of herbaceous edible species, I've gone entirely woody. So the understory is practically this wonderful native weed that's going to pretty much be my competition on the base and keep my weed, pressures really, really low. And then all of my kind of edible species, other than this is clearly an edible, but the rest of my edible species are woody species. The one exception to that rule is a temporary exception. It's this plant here, this Chamacrista festiculata. This is not actually an edible species. This is a native annual. I'm using it pretty much as a cover crop as the wild strawberries really start to fill in. This is filling in amongst them. And again, it's really there to hold the ground, stop weed seeds from getting established. And I expect within 2 or 3 years, the wild strawberries are going to outcompete all the Chamaecrista, and it's going to disappear. And maybe we'll have a couple popping up here and there, but for the most part, it's going to be gone. And it's just going to be just low-growing wild strawberry and a whole bunch of woody edibles. So let's talk about woody edibles. Most of the woody edibles are shrubs. I do indeed have a couple of trees mixed in. I am at Norcross, as I mentioned, my goal is to build habitat. And so in the process of building habitat, my major kind of, what I'm really planting are not cultivars. We're almost entirely planting, seed-grown plants as often as possible of seed that we collect ourselves. Some of it is local provenance, some of it is a bit of a broader provenance, but it's naturally occurring species, not cultivars. The one exception to that is this garden, the edible garden. And there was a lot of thought behind this. It's a lot more than just I want a Wells pawpaw or a pancake-based serviceberry. As I said, our goal is to build habitat. And amongst that, our goal is also to inspire other people to try and protect habitat as much as they can. So I've been making an argument for a little while now, talking about habitat loss and what every person can do to try and decrease habitat loss out on the landscape. There's a lot of different pieces to that puzzle, but one of them is that we lose a lot of habitat in this country and frankly around the world due to kind of large-scale agriculture. Meadows that have been cleared to become grazing land for cattle or kind of big-scale agriculture, which is very kind of, monoculturistic and, very chemical intensive and tends to mean decreases in habitat. So one of the things that we can all do to help to preserve habitat is to try and decentralize our food system. Support your small-scale local organic farms. Support these sort of farms that include, wildflower buffers and, grow a variety of different crops instead of a single, kind of corn or soybean sort of crop. And even further than that, grow your own food. The more food you're growing, the less reliant we are on this kind of large-scale agriculture and the less habitat loss due to it. And with that argument, there's actually a fair yet indirect argument to say that every tomato, pepper, bit of rosemary, all these non-native edible species that we're growing are actually kind of a step towards habitat preservation. Just that, if I grow my tomatoes, that's less tomatoes coming out of the big agricultural world. Extra added bonus means is if our tomatoes happen to, instead of being tomatoes, are native species that not only feed us, but also feed the ecosystem. And that's a great thing about our native edibles. Let's take a blueberry, for example. We think about the berry when we think about blueberries. Sometimes we forget the fact that the bumblebees are absolutely huge fans of the flowers, and we've got a variety of different native Lepidoptera, the caterpillars that turns into the butterflies and moths that will feed on the leaves. So we could plant a blueberry and net the darn thing and not let a single bird eat a single blueberry, and yet we are still feeding the wildlife through the flowers and the leaves. And so that's where these kind of native edibles come into account, and that's where these native edible cultivars come into account. I want as many people growing as much native food as possible. And the cultivars that I select were selected specifically for flavor, for production, for disease resistance, the sort of things that make it easier for anybody to grow these plants. So though I will tell people I want you growing as much natural species as possible, I'm not a black and white sort of individual. I like middle grounds and I like realistic answers, and I think growing cultivated food crops makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to show you a bunch of different cultivars here. I'm going to show you a single cultivar for every species we're growing. In a number of cases, there's a number of them, but I didn't see the need to list out, every single blueberry cultivar. So Asimina triloba on the left here, this is the pawpaw. This is a tree. What you're looking at there is the fruit. I will argue that this is probably, I think, the best tasting tree fruit in America. These are absolutely phenomenal in flavor. I've heard them called custard apples, custard pears. They definitely have a custard-like flavor to them. I don't think they taste much like an apple or a pear or a custard banana. That's the other name. The pawpaw tastes like pawpaw, and I highly recommend you try it. The downside to this fruit from a typical kind of agricultural point of view is that the fruit has pretty much no shelf stability. Once these fruits are ripe, you've got a couple of days, maybe a week with good storage to eat this thing before it just turns to mush. You can preserve them. You know, the custard, an actual custard is great. I've made a flan. You can definitely do preserves. I have no idea how you would ever dry this thing down, but I'm sure you could try. Canning it is definitely a good option, freezing it. That being said, this is never one that we could grow masses of here in Massachusetts and put on the truck to go out to California. It's just not going to happen. So you need to grow it yourself, or, you know, ask your local farmers to plant a few, or pick them up at the local farmers market, that sort of thing. Along here, Lavis, this is one of the many service berries that we're growing. Lavis is the one that really does grow into much more of a tree than your typical kind of shrubby forms. Around here, somewhere between 25 and 35, maybe 40 feet tall. Pancake Bay is a semi-dwarfed variety that tops out around 18 feet tall. These are absolutely wonderful flavored berries. We don't net our plants. I'm perfectly fine not getting any berries if the birds want to eat them all. That being said, we planted enough edibles and we have enough wildlife kind of refuge, just land here, that the birds have plenty to eat. So I expect to get a good crop on these. Keep in mind, these are very, very young gardens. So my Amelanchier laevis Pancake Bay is about 4 inches tall right now. My Asimida triloba is about 8 inches tall. It's going to be a couple of years before we see fruit, on these two at least. We will see fruit on our raspberries this year. So we've pretty much built a hedge of red raspberries, blackberries, and a few flowering raspberries that I'll get to in another slide or two. These are a bunch of different varieties of raspberries and blackberries and so forth. A number of these were selected for production and for flavor, but they were also selected to be a little less raspberry-like in their growth. They're a little better at kind of sitting put and not sending out 1,000 runners. Which is quite useful when you're trying to kind of mash a lot of stuff into a single space and not have them run into each other. So a number of these are working well as a bit of a kind of hedge in our area and can grow next to things like blueberries and, you know, chokeberries and currants without kind of overtaking them. We've got some nuts. We've got the American hazelnut in there. I have some shagbark hickories in production. They're not yet in the garden, but they'll get there at one point. We have, of course, you can't do a wild edible garden without blueberries. I think we've got 7 different blueberry varieties now planted, blueberry being one of my favorites. We have Prunus marittima, the beach plum, which is one of many native edible prunus species. It's the one species I now have in this garden. Sambucus canadensis elderberry is edible in 2 different ways. You can eat the flowers, which are in, they're still blooming now, and they're also just starting to produce fruit. The fruits are still very small and green at this point. But the flowers, typically you drink your elderflower cordial, and then you drink your elderberry wine. And so you can use this plant in 2 different ways. Rubus odoratus on the right there, that's thimbleberry. It's another rubus. This is a species that naturally tends to be a little better behaved than some of the other raspberries. So instead of including this one in the hedge, it's in this garden as freestanding plants in amongst some of these other species that we've been talking about. So we talked about how rubus can be a little over the top in terms of its growth form. I've actually found that Apios americana, the ground nut, is really not all that vigorous. It tends to get a bad rap for being a weed, and I think it's just that people don't tend to like twining vines all that much. But Helianthus tuberosus, sunchoke, is a beast. This thing spreads like wildfire, and despite the fact that it's a native species, it's one that, you know, I don't want my entire garden to be nothing but sunchokes. I want it to be some sunchokes. So I find that these do very, very well in containers. I actually planted 2 of these right next to each other in the container. As I mentioned, Apios is a twining species, so the nice thing is that it just twines right around the sunchokes, and the sunchokes are the support for the Apios. They're both a root crop, as you can see here. And the nice thing, again, about having these in containers is at the end of the season, instead of having to dig into the ground, I just dump all these containers out. And I've been doing this for years now. The ones in these containers are brand new, but I've been doing this at home for a long time, where every fall I will dump out these containers and I'll root around in the soil looking for these sorts of tubers, you know, nice, big, fat, tasty-looking tubers. And they go into pretty much a crate of sand and get stored in the root cellar, and they will last for months that way. In fact, the Apios can last for years in that manner. And all the small tubers that come out of that pot that are too small to bother with, they just go straight back into the pot with a little bit of fresh soil, and I do it again next year. It makes being able to grow these continuously really quite easy. The flavor on these is absolutely phenomenal. The sunchoke does indeed taste like a combination between a potato and an artichoke. The groundnut is the one I find more people are less familiar with. This tastes like somebody somehow took a roasted chestnut and crossed it with a potato. They are rich and sweet and nutty and absolutely wonderful and make the best chip I've ever had in my life. So after our edible garden, we're going to move into the cedar swamp. The cedar swamp is dominated by cedars, obviously enough. Most of the cedars in the swamp are Chamaecyparis thyoides, the Atlantic white cedar, but we do indeed have the eastern white cedar, Thuya occidentalis, mixed in as well. I keep meaning to plant a red cedar nearby on a kind of drier hill, that's Juniperus virginiana, just to be able to have all three, New England cedars kind of right next to each other. But for the moment, I just got the two. So as I said, this area gets kind of dark and damp. It's a very different environment than the dry meadows you just walked out of. You get a lot of moss kind of lining the trails and in amongst the trails. Amongst this moss, you find species like this one here, Coptis trifolia, the gold thread. If you dig down and see the roots on this, they're just a vibrant yellow gold color, hence the name. A couple other species mixed into this picture. There's Meadow canadense, the Canada mayflower, and that little star-looking thing there is starflower. Lysomachia borealis. Pagopteris connectilis, the broad beach fern, is one of my favorite ferns. Great on trail edges. It forms a patch, instead of clumping like a cinnamon fern, it forms a patch in a manner of, say, hay-scented fern, but without nearly the vigor of hay-scented fern, making it much more, I think, usable in kind of garden settings. I think you probably noticed at this point the gardens at Norcross range from things that actually look like a garden, like that edible garden, to things like the dry meadows that you could kind of argue a garden, but they're really more just a cultivated space, and not really a typical garden. We also have Oxalis montana just lining the ground in here. This is a species that I expect to see in the kind of mountains of New Hampshire. I rarely see it down low, and definitely not on the Connecticut borderline. But as I mentioned, the cedar swamp area is a dark, damp, cool sort of condition, so you can get species like Oxalis montana growing in here, despite the fact that it's not what you would naturally expect to see in this area. This is the mountain wood sorrel. It's a wonderful species, a tasty little leaf, and these beautiful kind of white flowers with these pink veins that are really kind of, they're good kind of signs to the pollinators. Hey, come land here, food right here. We also have a lot of Polygala paucifolium. This is one of my lies in today's class. This is well done blooming now, but it's such a nice plant, and we have so much of it. I wanted to be able to share it with you folks. This is the fringed Polygala, sometimes called fringed milkwort. This is a plant that I struggled to grow at Garden in the Woods for a number of years, and I come here to Norcross, and it's practically a weed. It's everywhere and doing very, very well. This time of year, without the flowers on it, it looks kind of like a smaller version of Gaultheria procumbens, the wintergreen. But if you look closely, you'll notice it's a little bit different, and it does not have that wintergreen flavor. They're in fruit now. The flowers on them are really quite phenomenal. So we start heading out of the cedar swamp. Before we get out entirely, we run into a nice patch of Pedicularis canadensis, the Canada wood betony. This is a hemiparasitic plant that needs a fungal intermediary to feed it nutrients that are taken from other forbs and trees in the area. It's a really cool species. We've got a bit of a couple different color forms in here that range from fully red to fully yellow, and then this one in the middle that's a combination of the two. A really, really cool plant. Another kind of a stretch of the truth on my part. These are in fruit right now. The flowers are past. They bloomed a little earlier. But a plant that I had not really become familiar with until I came to Norcross and wanted to share with y'all. So we get out of the cedar swamp and we start swinging around towards the wet meadow. In this picture here, you can see the kind of on the right, moving up the hill, that's still the dry meadows that are dominated by little bluestem. But as you kind of travel along the left, as you see in the trail here, you start getting much more moist. Immediately on the left is still the cedar swamp that we're now walking out of, and on the right is that dry meadow, and then we're kind of moving into the wet spot. Right in front of us here is Wisteria frutescens. We've got a couple flowers left on this one. This is the American wisteria, but for the most part, it's done flowering now. The picture that you're looking at the left is a picture I just took yesterday. The one flower that I found left is kind of hidden in this picture, but this is an absolutely beautiful wisteria, and not nearly as vigorous and definitely not invasive the way the Japanese wisteria can be. So getting into the wet meadow, I think Monarda fistulosa is the dominant species in here among Solidago rugosa, one of those really strong spreading Solidagos that I try and kind of keep knocked down a little bit so that other plants can continue to exist amongst them. Monarda fistulosa is the wild bergamot. We do also have Monarda didyma, the scarlet bee balm, mixed in here, but bergamot is by far the more common of the two species in this space. It ranges from this kind of, lavender-like color to, we also have some pure white forms in here that I meant to collect seed off of last year and grow out to see if any of the next generation will come true, but I forgot to flag them when they were in flower, and by the time they were in fruit, I couldn't tell which was white and which was not. So we'll try that again this year. We have a couple different Liatris in this meadow, the main one being Pycnanthemum. They're all called blazing stars, and what's the other name? Gay feather is the other common name. We also have Liatris spicata and Liatris aspera mixed in here, but Pycnanthemum is by far the more common of them. At least two different species of Pycnanthemum in this space, Pycnanthemum virginianum on the left and Muticum on the right. Ironically enough, Muticum has the smaller flower, and yet is still the showier plant. And the way it does that is by producing these large silvery bracts that really are attractive to pollinators from a distance. And by the time they get up close, they're able to find those much smaller, kind of light pink flowers that you can see at the center of those bracts. Virginianum has quite a bit of a larger flower, but a much less showy bract. Both cool species. In the dry meadows, one of the plants I didn't call out is Pycnanthemum tenuifolium, which is the narrow leaf mountain mint, which is quite a bit more narrow in leaf than the Virginianum that you're looking at here. Enothera fruticosa is quite a useful plant, and what I mean by that is, especially in meadows, there tends to be a break between kind of your early season spring blooming plants and your kind of summer meadow blooming plants. Enothera fruticosa is very good at bridging that gap. It's been blooming for about 2 weeks now and probably has another week in it. And the Monarda fistulosa is really just starting to kick in now. The Liatris hasn't yet actually opened its flowers. And the Enothera has been going since the violets were still blooming and since the Amsonia that we've also got in this meadow have been blooming. So it's a nice kind of, plant that kind of holds its own in between the bloom seasons. Speckled throughout this meadow are both the closed bottle gentian and the open fringe gentian. The fringe gentian is a biennial species that needs to be able to pretty much seed into place every year. So what we do to manage this one is I do my meadow kind of management in early spring. I like to do my mowing in spring. We usually mow this meadow probably once every 3 to 5 years, depending. If we're on the 5-year line, it means we've been in there with the weed whackers, taking out some of the tree seedlings before they come up to size. Otherwise, we'll do it on a 3-year basis. The exception for that is for these gentians, the Gentianopsis specifically. Wherever the gentians are flowering, we'll mark them so that we can make sure to see them. When they're in bloom, you do not miss these things. But once they go into fruit, they become a little harder to spot. And once the fruit is mature, I will get in there with one of the tractor kind of mowers, and I will mow quite low to the point where I'm kind of scalping the soil. And what I'm doing there is I'm hitting these gentians when the fruit is ripe and the seed is ready. And so I'm dispersing the seed, and at the same time, I'm kind of cutting into the soil a little bit to do some soil disturbance to really ensure that this seed comes right into contact with the soil and kind of knock back some of the meadow competition right around where I just dropped this seed. It's been quite an effective method for making sure these Gentianopsis are able to constantly drop seed, germinate in place, and we've got a really, healthy population because of this. The bottle gentians, you don't need to do that for. They're a true perennial. They'll come back every year. The mowing that we do probably doesn't hurt them because they're fruiting at the exact same time as the fringe gentian. That being said, they don't necessarily need the same treatment. Some of the taller plants that pop up in amongst some of these kind of mid to smaller size ones, the Vernonia that we've got in this meadow, we have both Novibor sensis and one that we finally identified last fall. It's actually a hybrid between Missouriensis and Arkansas. But most of what we got in there is the New York ironweed. We've also got Thermopsis caroliniana, the Carolina lupin. So those of you may have noticed that the plants that I've got in here and amongst the rest of the Norcross Sanctuary are not necessarily Massachusetts naturally occurring species. We've kind of gone a little bit different in terms of our definition of native here at Norcross. We've adopted the definition that Rick Dark and Doug Talamay put forth in The Living Landscape. Instead of defining native based on a geographic range and a timeline, i.e., say, native if present in Massachusetts before European settlement, we've aligned our definition with their kind of definition, which fits our goal of building habitat much more effectively. So their definition, I'll paraphrase here, I should have actually pulled up the real definition, but it's something to the extent of a plant is native when it's been in an area long enough to develop complex and beneficial relationships with the ecosystem. And so what that means is we're talking about native based on ecological function. And that complex part is really important. Because without that, you could make the argument that purple loosestrife is native because the, Bombus impatiens likes to visit it. But Bombus impatiens is a generalist species. It'll visit hundreds, if not thousands, of different plants. So you've got a beneficial relationship, at least right there. I don't think we can argue that purple loosestrife is beneficial, but to Bombus impatiens it might be. But the complexity is not there. That's the important piece. So for something like Thermopsis caroliniana, despite the fact that this is not a plant that would naturally occur in this area, I am finding specialist bees visiting this species. New England native specialist insects that visit this species, which means that I can say these are complex and beneficial ecological relationships. And for us, with our goal of building habitat, to finding native based on these complex and ecological relationships really fits us nicely. And allows us to pay homage to Arthur Norcross and his love of the pine barrens, but also at the same time ensure that the work we're doing is continuing to always have that guise of building habitat. Okay, getting out of the wet meadows. I'll check my timing. Okay, doing okay. We're going to move into those pine barrens. So the pine barrens do indeed have some species that are native to the New Jersey pine barrens and don't naturally occur here in New England. That being said, the vast majority of the New Jersey pine barren species are species that also occur here in New England. We have plants like Salix nigra and Salix bebiana. These are native willows, absolutely essential plants for our native bumblebees in the early season. The willows bloom before just about anything else is in bloom. Maybe not anything else. You got things like skunk cabbage blooming, but these are very, very early in the season, particularly important for the bees, before the kind of meadows start kicking in and you've got lots of forage for them. The willows kind of play that early season role. Spice bush, another good option for you if you're looking for a shrub with that early season effect. Salix nigra can grow either as a shrub or a tree. If left alone, it'll turn into a 40, 60, maybe 80-foot tree. The nice thing about it is you can just chop it right to the ground and it regrows with 100 stems and pretty much forms a shrub. And with these narrow leaves that you can see here, it looks quite a bit like a bamboo. And so I've been recommending it. There's a lot of people out there who really like the look of bamboos, and planting bamboo in this area is really not the best of ideas. So Salix nigra, managed as such, as in cut down every 4 or 5 years, can work effectively as a non-bamboo but bamboo-like hedge, and really is quite nice. The nice thing about it, too, is if you kind of cut it back every, I'd say, probably 5 to maybe 8 years, you can have somewhere between 5 and probably 25 stems on it, and is absolutely covered in flowers, and the bees definitely make good use of it. Salix bebiana, the beech willow, is a shrub. It's never turning into a tree. It might get 12 feet tall, maybe. Usually they're in the kind of 5 to 8 foot range, but I've definitely seen them get bigger than that. And from there, it's one that, again, the nice thing with willows and with the rest of these pine barren species I'm about to go into is a lot of these are disturbance-adapted species. In the pine barrens, in many cases, it's fire-adapted. And what that means is that I've got a landscape that is dominated both by woody and herbaceous plants, and I go in there every couple of years, 3 to 5 to 8 years, and I cut the whole damn thing down. And the nice thing about that is it means it gives the herbaceous plants a couple of years of really good sun to really, bulk up and thrive and produce seed and really do quite well, knowing at the same time that every woody species that I just cut to the ground is coming back on me. And it also means that I can cut down things like Ulmus incana, which I don't have a picture of here, speckled alder, which would really push to really dominate this meadow or these pine barrens. I can cut that back heavily and then leave up certain species like Salix nigra that I really want to encourage that could use a little bit of extra help from a competitive point of view. We have a variety of different blueberries in this area. The two common, or the two high bush species we've got are Vaccinium corymbosum, which is the one we just call high bush blueberry. Sometimes I like to refer to it as common high bush blueberry just to distinguish it from the guy on the right here, Vaccinium fuscatum, the black high bush blueberry. This one is quite common on the landscape here at Norcross, but if you don't know to look for it, you'll think it's all just Vaccinium corymbosum, the common high bush. The fuscatum blooms about a week to 2 weeks earlier than corymbosum, though by the time they start fruiting, they both kind of caught up with each other, and they're just starting to ripen their fruit now for us. I've had a couple tasty berries so far. Most of them have been bluish and quite tart, but they're coming. We have two different spireas in our pine barrens. Spirea alba, the meadow sweet. What you're looking at here, the flowers haven't actually opened yet, but it was a dewy morning and just made for a beautiful picture, so why the heck not? And Spirea tomentosa, the steeplebush. Meadow sweet on the left there will bloom either pure white or sometimes kind of lightly pink, but tomentosa can really give you that vibrant pink. Both wonderful species, both very happy with the cutback. And one of the things I've noticed with these is that despite the fact that I cut them back last year, they're still blooming for me this year. Hold up just a sec. Sorry, shared office. Okay, so moving along, another species that we've got less of in here than I would like, and one that I purposely did not cut back to really give it that competitive advantage, is Clethrol nifolia, the summer sweet. This is a wonderful species that really fits this area very, very well, but has only, it's only been in there in small doses. So where I went around and cut a lot of stuff back heavily, the Clethra were purposely left up in order to kind of proliferate themselves a bit more. Did the exact same thing with the chokeberries, Aronia melanocarpa, the black chokeberry, that we've got 5 or 6 decent specimens of, but I'd rather see 50 or 60. Peppered throughout all of these is Dassiflora floribunda, the one that we originally called potentilla. This is the shrubby cinquefoil. This is one that you find this in every nursery in America. I mean, you'll find, and I mean by, if you go to the Walmart or the Home Depot nurseries, this is a common species there, and most people don't realize it's a native species, but it's quite a useful native species that grows anywhere from standing wet to bone dry. Another one we've got quite a bit of in here. This is one that's much more common in the New Jersey pine barrens. I don't think this one actually naturally occurs anywhere in Massachusetts. This is Hypericum densiflorum, the bushy St. John's wort. We've also actually just started planting Hypericum prolificum, which looks almost identical to this species, but prolificum grows in the very dry areas, where densiflorum grows in the very wet areas. And this pine barrens garden is indeed very wet. We've got a separate dry pine barren space that I'm not even going to talk about today. So we talked about a bunch of woody species in there. Let me tell you about the herbaceous layer. A lot of those woody species have been cut back and aren't really showing as much this year, and yet these herbaceous plants are really showing off quite nicely. We have 2 different native loosestrife, Lismachia quadrifolia on the left and Lismachia terrestris on the right. These are absolutely wonderful species, both in bloom now. Quadrifolia bloomed first and is still blooming, but it's starting to pass. Terrestris is really in full bloom now. It's looking pretty much what it looks like in this picture right now. Lots of flowers on the bottom, the top still being closed buds that are getting ready to bloom. We've got a lot of pitcher plants in this garden. This was one of the main reasons I decided to cut it back heavily from the woody point of view. I wanted to give the pitcher plants a chance to kind of absorb some good light, not have the competition of the woodies for a couple of years, and really show off. The flowers are just really robust right now. The color is starting to fade on them as they go past flower and into fruit. And I expect to see a lot of fruit drop and hopefully a whole lot of new species or new individuals in the next couple of years. Xerophyllum asphadoides. This is one that I think it might be considered extant in New England. If it's still here, it's very rare in New England. It's a bit more common in the New Jersey area. And then if you go to the West Coast, there's some West Coast species that are very, very common. This is called turkey beard. Flowers on this one are past now. The picture is a bit of a lie. But they are an absolutely wonderful species. The foliage looks pretty much like grass, and then you see these big kind of flower heads sticking up out of it. Our calopogons are in full bloom right now. The grass pink, this is one of the more common kind of bog orchids that you'll find in our area, also in the New Jersey pine barrens. Also notice in this picture the little crab spider hitting in amongst the flowers. We also have Liatris farinosa, the unicorn root. This is another one it's much more common in the New Jersey area of pine barrens than you'd find it in New England. I believe this one gets into Rhode Island, but I'd have to check my maps to really confirm that. But a really wonderful species that grows anywhere from dry pine barrens to wet pine barrens and just about everywhere in between. We seem to have most of them in our dry areas, mostly because the competition there is a little lighter, and so these are able to thrive. But we find them growing in wet spots as well. And a plant that I had no idea was actually existing in this area until this year, when we removed a lot of the woody material and was able to see it. We have quite a bit of Asclepias incrinata in here, the rose or swamp milkweed. In fact, the ones that are popping up now are a much richer, deeper pink than I've got in the picture here. But the only picture I had was from last year, a different location altogether. I think that picture might have come from Garden in the Woods. Another really cool species we've got in this area is Sanguisorba canadensis, the Canada burnet. Really cool foliage on this one that it undergoes a process called glutation, similar to what strawberries can do, where you get a little dewdrops that are exuded on every tooth of the leaf. Really quite beautiful in the mornings before those dewdrops, kind of dissipate on you. But a very cool kind of flower spike that comes up. Okay, so before we get into the next garden, we've got to walk along our boardwalk. I was not able to bring myself to give you pictures of this boardwalk right now. We had a hailstorm come through here last week, and the swamp, the skunk cabbage in there looks like Swiss cheese, and it's very, very sad looking at the moment. So forewarning, if you come in right now and see this in person, this is a picture I took last year. Our skunk cabbage is really sad looking at the moment. They'll be perfectly fine in the long run, but it's a bit unfortunate to see. And especially the morning after the hailstorm, it was a very stinky walk. So amongst the skunk cabbage, we have a lot of ferns, mostly cinnamon fern, but there's also interrupted fern in here. There's royal fern in here. There's some Meadows, the fiddlehead or ostrich fern in here as well. We have quite a bit of marsh fern in here and a couple less common species as well. You eventually swing along this boardwalk and get kind of kicked out into the lime flower cobbles. This is the area I mentioned earlier that was built up with a lot of dolomitic limestone. So we've got this natural or unnaturally higher pH in here that allows us to grow a lot of species that you might not normally see in our area. Actaea racemosa is one that in the wild naturally grows in these limestone outcrops. That being said, in cultivation, this is perfectly fine with acidic soils. It'll grow anywhere from full sun to dense shade. It's perfectly fine with acid to alkaline. This is kind of a planted anywhere sort of plant. It's also one that we kind of go through our decisions as to whether or not to kind of cut them back in the late season. I've got a general rule in terms of deadheading in the gardens. My rule is don't deadhead unless you've got a good reason to. I'll never understand why we go back and cut back all of the bird seed and all of the free plants that seed on our plants represent. It's something that I'd rather not do unless I've got a good reason to do it. So in the case of Actaea racemosa, this is a plant that can be quite vigorous in terms of its sending seed around and growing quite heavily. And it's one that I like to plant in amongst some really delicate plants like lady slippers and like Caulophyllum phyllectroides. I think I've got there's my lady slipper. So I leave this plant up and don't deadhead it at all when it's in areas where I want it to spread strongly. And I plant this one in kind of dense oak, pine, hemlock canopied areas where I really want it to spread all over the place. But where it's growing right next to my lady slippers, it's one that I deadhead to try and stop it from seeding right next to these more delicate plants. So you can kind of decide how to treat this one. We have some big honking patches of small yellow lady slipper here at Norcross. I'm speaking today as if I can claim credit for all this stuff. I've been here for a little more than a year now. A lot of the gardens that I've been showing you today are the result of my predecessor, Leslie Duffy, who spent 38 years here building these gardens. I can take credit for some of it, but the lady slippers I can take no credit for. I will, but I shouldn't. Caulophyllum phyllectroides is another one that we've got these kind of large patches of. This is the blue cohosh. We don't have, or at least I have not yet found Caulophyllum giganteum, the early blue cohosh, which I'm hoping to introduce to the site. For the moment, everyone I've been seeing has been phyllectroides. They're pretty easy to tell apart. If you catch them in flower, they become a lot harder to tell apart a little later in the season. Some differences in leaf morphology, but it's the sort of differences where if they're right next to each other, you notice them. But if you're just out in the woods and you see one and you want to tell which it is, it can be a bit of a challenge. We've got quite a bit of Carex grayi in here. This is a very, very cool sedge. It's quite an uncommon species. I believe it's considered rare in Massachusetts. It's also one of the few species that I can actually identify, which is quite helpful for the sedges because I'm getting better with my sedges, but they can be a real challenge to tell the different species apart. But there are some outliers that just look very unique, gray sedge being one of them, with these really large achenes that are very showy. They almost look like a medieval weapon, these kind of ball and chain or maces structures. Not a colorful plant, but despite that, still a very showy plant. We have quite a bit of Hydrastis canadensis in these gardens now. I gave you a picture of flowers now. The flowers are long gone. They're in fruit now, though the fruits have not yet showed color. We're looking at a lot of green fruits now. They'll turn a deep kind of cherry red as they mature. This is one of those species that believe this one's federally endangered. If it's not federally endangered, it's definitely on the rare, spectrum in one way or another. But it's practically a weed in the gardens here at Norcross. It's really quite wonderful that it does so well here. And if you dig down into this, you'll see this vibrant golden rhizome and roots that gives it the name golden seal. Okay, so getting out of the lime flower cobbles, we move along to the gravel bank. The reason I put in this picture here, I want to show you that this is, the gravel bank is not brand new. The trail we installed was put in pretty much right before I arrived. I actually helped finish it. The major kind of earth moving work was done, and we kind of finished, topping it. And so what we've got here is an area where on either side of this new trail, there's nothing left, either because the plants were, destroyed by the equipment that we had to bring in order to build this trail, or because we brought in a lot of new material and buried, our seed bank and our plants that were in that place. There was some transplanting done to rescue some plants, but for the most part, the edges of this new trail are really quite barren. And so I have been really focusing on trying to plant these edges, and they're a lot less barren than they look in this picture here. We've just been constantly adding to it. I am a firm believer in the usefulness of soil testing, and I did some soil testing at the gravel bank and throughout, the rest of my gardens. Gravel bank soil is literally 97% sand, and almost didn't register in terms of nutrients. So we've got a very, very, very thin soil here, and it means that we have to be very, very specific about the plants that we grow in this bank. This is also an area that there's no way to put a deer fence around here. So not only do you have extremely difficult environmental conditions, but you have high deer browse. So this is a learning space for a lot of landscapers who are looking for solution plants for very tough conditions. We've got some good ones here for you. So actually, before I get into it, I'll use this picture here. I think I have some drawing tools here. I haven't ever used these before, but yeah, let's try this. So this plant here, more of it here, a different species here, and some kind of more kicking through here. What you're looking at there is Amsonia. Most of it is Amsonia tabernae montana, but that thinner leaf stuff is Amsonia ciliata. Up until my time here at Norcross, I thought Amsonia would not ever do well in this sort of bone-dry, full sun conditions, but it thrives out here. It's got a lot more drought tolerance than I ever gave it credit for. So if you've never used Amsonia in these barren, dry spots, I would say definitely give it a shot. It seems to do just fine. Most of this stuff that I'm hoping you're all seeing my highlighter on back here is Comptonia, Comptonia peregrina. This is the, actually think I have a picture of this one in a moment, so I'll just fly where I buy it for the moment. It's a sweet fern. Come on. Oh, I need to turn off the highlighter. And there we go. Okay, so we have two different milkweeds out here. We have the common milkweed that I'm happy to see colonizing this area. Anyone who ever says common milkweed grows too vigorously for garden settings has never gardened in a gravel bank. We also have Asclepias tuberosa, the butterfly milkweed that you're looking at here, this vibrant orange flower. This one's in full bloom right now. It looks absolutely phenomenal. Baptisia tinctoria is one we've just introduced to this area. We've got this in other parts of Norcross that are similar in conditions, these bone-dry sandy sites. This is one that, again, like the Ionactis I mentioned earlier, does not do well in good soils. It'll get too tall and flop over and kind of open up in the center. But in these really challenging conditions, it does very well. It's about 3 feet wide, maybe about 2.5 feet tall, forms a nice rounded mound, and it's just covered in these yellow flowers that have really just started opening now. We've got Echinacea purpurea in here. This is one of those plants that your kind of personal definition of native, whether it's by geographic region or by ecological region, will kind of start to change whether you want to call this native or not. What I've always said is that it's native enough for me because this one does indeed support a lot of specialist kind of interactions here in New England. We also just introduced Echinacea pallida, the pale coneflower, to this site. There's our Comptonia that I promised you a picture of. You can see why it's called sweet fern. The foliage looks quite fern-like, but this is a woody flowering shrub. The flowers are not very showy, but it's technically a flowering shrub and therefore not a true fern. Wonderful scent of this foliage. This is a great one to have on trail edges because as people brush up against it, the whole area has this kind of sweet, spicy, cinnamon-like smell. Solidago puberella. If I've got to pick one favorite goldenrod, this has got to be it. The downy goldenrod, a well-behaved species with a nice kind of wand-shaped flower, the standing erect flower that sets it apart from most of the goldenrods. Again, as I said earlier, goldenrods have nothing to do with hay fever other than the fact that they bloom at the same time as ragweed that does cause hay fever. We also just introduced Tripsicum dactyloides to this site, the gamma grass. If you notice that these fruiting bodies, ignore the flowers for a second, the fruiting bodies look a little bit like modern-day corn. If you do a genetic kind of assay of modern-day corn, you'll find that at one point, way back a long time ago, gamma grass was bred into what we now treat as modern-day corn. There's little bits of genetic kind of results from modern-day corn that could not have come from anything but this species. And the flowers on it, as you can see here, are really quite phenomenal. Another plant that you would not find here in New England naturally, this is Calleroian volucrata, the purple poppy mallow, a vibrant magenta pink flower that's just, it looks like a cultivar, it's not. This is just naturally occurring. This is the color you get. The yellow blur you see in the background of this picture is Rudbeckia hirta. Same with the yellow blur in the background of this picture. Monarda punctata here, the spotted bee balm. In general, the bee balms don't do well in very dry soils. I found that Monarda fistulosa will do drier sites reasonably well, but the gravel bank is beyond drier and just into bone dry. And Monarda fistulosa really doesn't do well out there in that extreme dry soil, but Monarda punctata does it just fine. The spotted bee balm is a short-lived species that's quite good at seeding in to these kind of open environments, and these bone dry areas tend to be quite open. There's a lot of exposed sand. Monarda punctata, we both, despite the fact that it's a short-lived individual, you'll have long-lived populations because it's constantly dropping seed and seeding into place. An annual species we've got out there, Trichostoma dichotomum. This is blue curls, an adorable little plant that you really don't notice at all until it starts flowering, and one of the few plants in the horticultural spectrum that actually produces a blue flower. I don't know how many people have noticed, but we horticulturists like to lie about color all the time. We call things blue that are purple. We call things red that are pink. This one can really go true blue. Another plant we just introduced to the site, and another one that would not be naturally occurring here in New England, but again fits that ecological value kind of spectrum, Helianthus mollis, the downy sunflower. We do actually have some wonderful, naturally occurring sunflowers that we're planting in other parts of the garden, but in terms of these really challenging conditions, mollis, I think, is really the best choice for us, and this is, again, one that fits our personal definition of native. You can see how coated in kind of down in these hairs this plant is. You can see it on the left there, and then the flower on the right should look quite a bit like the sunflower that we all kind of know. We've built this little bog bump out here. As I said, this was a gravel pit that we, that has been, had a stream diverted into it, both in and out. So we've got, water here. It's ironic that we've got, such a bone dry site. But then as you get right down to the water level, we've got these kind of wet loving plants. And we put in this little bog bump out to show off some species that grow in bog conditions that weren't already occurring out here. Iris cristata grows, quite well all along the edges of this pond, does us, very, very well and kind of colonizes the edges and helps hold the bank in place. We've also got Parnassia grandifolia. This is one we just put into this bog bump out. I've never understood the common name on this one. It's not a grass and it's not from Parnassus, but it gets the name Grassa Parnassus. Rexia virginica, the meadow beauty. Also notice the little hoverfly in this picture. This is a wonderful species that we just moved into our bog bump out. And one that thrives along this area, Sebacia kennediana. This is Plymouth gentian. This is an extremely rare, I want to say federally endangered species. And I think the reason it does so well here is that the exit of this pond is a pipe that we've got a couple different sizes for. So we're able to adjust the water levels in this pond, and we do that to mimic coastal kettle pond conditions. And that's where Sebacia naturally grows. And I think because of it, the Sebacia here has grown very well. And we've got a species that does absolutely phenomenal that in the wild is very much in danger of extinction. So we're pretty much done with our walk now. I'm going to take us along the upper trail to kind of get back. What we've done at the upper trail is we've tried to display a way to convince people to keep downwood on the landscape. Downwood is an important part of habitat on the landscape, and I find that in my time as a kind of garden consultant for a lot of woodland gardeners, people have a natural tendency to want to clean up their woodlands. They want to kind of pull away the down debris and just make it look a little neater. And though that does give you a nice kind of clean look, it also means you're removing an important kind of habitat feature from the landscape. So what we've started doing at the upper trail is to pretty much take this downwood and just lay it out. We've made these kind of long snaking patterns. We've also made these circular patterns that actually kind of accidentally turned out looking a little bit like sacrificial pits. But the idea here is that we've built something kind of semi-artistic and very natural and showed people a way to keep the downwood on the landscape, but also make it look a little more purposeful and a little bit cleaner. So it allows you, it's not quite as good as simply leaving it in place, but it's something that a lot of people can use as a happy middle between the two. And this is, as I said, an important part of habitat on the landscape. Okay, this has never happened to me before. It's 1 o'clock. We're supposed to end at 1 o'clock, and I got to my questions. I'm always, Penny will second this, I'm never on time. I guess if we did this really right, I should have ended 5 minutes earlier for questions, but I'm going to call this a win.
Good job, Dan.
It's a first. Don't ever expect to see it again.
Okay, we do have several questions for you. What was the pink still be looking thing the Spirea tomentosa? And
yep.
And where would you locate that?
So this pink, let me get it. Oh wait, I'm in the wrong garden here. It was indeed Spirea tomentosa. We had the two Spireas, alba being the white one, or sometimes pink tinged, and then here you go, this pink one being tomentosa. As far as where you get it, if you're asking about where to buy it, it's a plant that is not very common in the horticultural trade, but if you get into nurseries that specialize in natives, you can definitely find it. Garden in the Woods has carried this one for years. You can also get it at Nasami Farm. If you go to the Grow Native, what is it? Grow Native, the Massachusetts plant sale that they do every year, they will often have this one available. It's also one that I've seen available through some nurseries like Pinelands Nurseries and other ones that focus on native kind of woody species. In terms of where you would plant this one, naturally occurring, you'll find this often growing in usually kind of slow-moving but flowing swamps. I see this at Great Meadows all the times. You'll see it on kind of stream edges, river edges. I've seen it in kind of open, wet meadows as well. That being said, I've taken this kind of wetland species and stuck it in just average garden soils, and it's always done just fine for me. So if you're talking about cultivating in your garden, unless you've got a really dry site, this one really does quite well. And frankly, I would expect it to do well in dry as well. I haven't yet tested that, but I find that especially Spirea alba, the one on the left side, that one will happily grow in standing wet conditions. It'll also happily grow in very dry soils as well.
Okay, very good. Can you recommend a low mounding native for a sunny site?
Low mounding native for sunny site. Let's see. Well, Iamactis linearifolia, the stiff aster, is a good option for you. Especially if we're talking dry soils, that one rarely gets much more than about 8 inches tall. The Baptisia tinctoria is a wonderful mounding plant. It gets a little bit taller, getting in the 24 to maybe 30-inch range. So if that's getting too tall, we can kind of cut that one off. Other good options, if you're looking for some woody species, that Dasyphilora floribunda, that the shrubby cinquefoil is a good option for you. There are some great St. John's worts, Hypericum prolificum. I don't know if I'd call that low mounding, so maybe cut that one off just because of the fact that it's not all that low. Let's see, what else do I have? Asclepias tuberosa, that's a great option. The butterfly milkweed, the one I showed you pictures of with the vibrant orange flowers, that one's very good, stays quite low, usually 12 to 18 inches tall, and is perfectly happy in the sun. Other good options, if you want a spreader, the Fragaria virginiana is very happy in sunny, dry conditions. It is a spreader. It's, if by mounder you mean it'll kind of mound and then stay in place, it's not a good option. But if you don't mind something spreading, Fragaria is wonderful for you. Rus aromatica, the low sumac, it's the one sumac that is really quite well behaved and works well in garden settings. There's a cultivated form called Growlow that tops out around 3 feet tall that could work very well for you. And if you don't mind working with cultivars, there are some dwarf chokeberries. In fact, there's one called Low Scape Mound, or maybe Low Moundscape, one of those two. It's a black chokeberry. That's a really great option for low-growing species. One of the things I'll also point out is you see here my website, dantjaffe.com. If you hop on there, there's a link to the database that I built when I was at Garden in the Woods. That database allows you to punch in things like sun, dry, height limitations, things like that, and it'll spit out a whole list of plants for you, many more than the half dozen I just actually thought of.
Oh, that's a great resource. Thank you, Dan. Does Norcross have an annual plant sale?
It does not yet. That's something that we've talked about setting up, and we may set up in the future. At the moment, there's no official direct plans to do it. We definitely won't want to have one next year. That being said, one of the things I'm happy to do at Norcross is to trade plants. So if you happen to be a grower, or if you've got something that we don't have that we want, we are happy to make plant trades. I'm also have built what I call botanical philanthropy into my budget, where I am happy to grow plants and pretty much give them away to like-minded organizations that are trying to do kind of habitat construction work, restoration work. This is not something that I can support doing on a large scale, so I'm sorry if you're just a residential gardener, I can't make this available to you. But if you represent a restoration company or some other nonprofit that's doing the sort of work that we'd want to support, then please feel free to reach out. And we are very limited in the amount that we can do, and for this season it's already chock full, and for next year it probably is as well. But I'm happy to listen to your case and possibly include you on our botanical philanthropy list.
All right, that's very generous of your organization. While we're waiting for your annual plant sale to begin, where would we locate showy goldenrod?
That is one that I know Grow Native Massachusetts has had in their annual plant sale in the past, and it is one that I know Garden in the Woods started selling, I think, probably 2, maybe 3 years ago. So they are both good options for you. I believe you can get that one through North Creek Nurseries. So if you've got a commercial account with them, or if you're a member of like a garden club or someone else can get a commercial account, they're a good option for kind of plugs of that species. It's also one of many goldenrods that are extremely easy to grow from seed. So if you've never grown anything from seed and you want to kind of try and get your feet into the propagation game, goldenrods are a really good kind of place to get started. And though I'm not able to, sell plants right now, nor just kind of randomly give away stuff, I am happy to offer seed up. And I again, it's something where I'm somewhat limited in what I can offer, but showy goldenrod is one that I plan on collecting this year. I will collect lots of seed. So if anyone wants some showy goldenrod seed, feel free to shoot me an email. And if you come out for a visit, I'd happily, kind of hand you some seed.
Excellent. You talked a little bit about your meadow maintenance schedule. So
yes.
Was it correct that you said you do not do any annual mowing?
So we have I have no idea how many meadows we have in Norcross, and they all get a little bit of a different, kind of maintenance schedule that is customized to the individual meadow and what's growing there, and to some extent what might be nesting there. Whenever possible, I push for spring mowings because from an insect point of view, that's a lot more helpful than doing the fall mowing that I was originally taught to do. There are some exceptions to that based on some ground nesting birds and some various different turtle species. And so in some cases, a fall mowing is still preferred. But when in doubt, or when I know that I don't have to worry about certain birds or certain turtles, I'm mowing in the early spring. And there are some meadows that I mow. There's one meadow, there's one of my little blue stem meadows where I've got some Eurograsses that have been kind of invading in on me. And I will mow that thing pretty much like a lawn, starting in early spring up until probably about mid to late June. And what I'm doing there is I'm cutting back those Eurograsses that are growing and growing and growing in the early season, and I'm mowing at about a 6-inch top. And up until June, the little blue stem is just staying down there, well below a 6-inch range, and I can just mow and mow and mow and just keep hitting the Eurograss. And then come June, late June into July, the little blue stem really starts putting on growth, and that's when I'll stop my mowing regimen, allowing the little blue stem the competitive advantage. And the nice thing about that is the little blue stem will win that war because these meadows are very, very dry, very, very thin. And so as the nutrients kind of leave this meadow, this is part of our older kind of style of lawn care maintenance, and there is fertilizer being used. As the fertilizer really dissipates, the Eurograss is really going to peter out and the little blue stem will kind of win the fight. The nice thing about that mowing regimen I just described, it's kind of speeding up the battle. Most of my meadows I'm mowing on a 3-year kind of annual basis if I'm looking to just get in there with the tractor and just mow it. I can stretch that into the 5 to 8 years range, especially for some of the drier meadows that are slower growing. For the wet meadows, it's probably 3 to 5 years. And the way I stretch that is I'll pull out a weed whacker, and by that I mean one of the bladed weed whackers, not a string trimmer. And I'll get into the meadow and weed whack out, alders or poplars or white pine or the sort of trees that would eventually turn that meadow from a meadow back to a forest. And in our case, we're trying to keep them as meadow. And so if I can be somewhat, strategic about hitting those trees, then I don't need to necessarily mow the whole meadow down that year, and I can push it off for another year or two. In general, the wet meadows are more vigorous, and they're on a 1 to 3 year mowing schedule. The dry meadows are a little slower growing and can be on a 1 to 3 to 5 to maybe even 8 year mowing schedule. Again, with those kind of weed whackers coming in for those longer stretches of time.
All right, very good. Are the buds of the native wisteria sufficiently weather tolerant for reliable bloom?
Oh, yes. And the nice thing about the native wisteria flowers versus the Chinese or the Japanese species is that they'll bloom quite young. The Asian species, I'm not exactly sure why they evolved this strategy, but they don't bloom until probably the 7th or 8th year of flowering. So if you buy a little wisteria at the nursery, you're waiting for years for it to start flowering. And it's kind of ironic that it tends to be, somewhat slow growing at first, and then it can all of a sudden take off and become down south it's considered quite an invasive species. Our Native American wisteria, which I believe gets as far north as southern Pennsylvania, is hardy at least to zone 5. I want to say that's hardy to zone 4. I'd want to check that, but it's at least hardy to zone 5. Does perfectly fine around here and flowers for us consistently and has been for many, many years.
Okay, excellent. You mentioned that you like to kill the lawns. What is your method for killing the lawns before you go to an alternative ground cover?
Right. It ranges a bit from spot to spot, and this is something that I'd say that's an important part of this answer, because depending on your conditions, my strategies may or may not work for you. So the kind of quick ones I'll breeze past because I really don't do them all that often. Some people like, the herbicide treatment. They'll spray a bunch of glyphosate and go from there. I try and avoid that as often as I can, and I've not found the need for that here at Norcross. Another good option that I don't use as often, but is still a good option, is to solarize an area. And with that, I mean laying down some UV-resistant clear plastic, usually in the kind of 4 to 6 millimeter range. Make sure the edges are all kind of battened down quite nicely. What I actually like to do is bury my edges. And what that's going to do is start to pretty much cook the soil. And this is quite good at killing off your grass plants as well as the roots of them. It'll also kill off your seed bank, which is quite beneficial if you want to use it, say, to deal with an invasive species. The advantage is that it will also kill off that seed bank, and that's a good thing when we're talking invasives. The bad thing about that is it's pretty much sterilizing your soil. So if you've got good, happy, healthy soils and you solarize, you've pretty much then killed off all the important soil biology. So I still think this is quite a good strategic tool to be used. The reason I mention that is what I always say is after you finish the solarizing and the kind of killing part of the process, you want to lay down a good top dressing of compost to start bringing that soil back to life. And with good, healthy soil, even when you sterilize it, all those kind of building blocks, all that food is still there. So with a reintroduction of a good, healthy compost, you can kind of bring those populations back to life quite quickly. Soil life is very good at kind of boom and bust cycles. And that's a great way to kill off lawn. What I use more often than anything, though, is that I go through a smothering operation. I will use a product called Ramboard. There's probably other similar products around, but what it pretty much is a product that painters use to protect floors. It's just a big roll of cardboard. And I will lay that down over my lawn, and then I will top it off with some new material, whatever I happen to have on hand. If I'm just leaving it for a while, I'll often just use, kind of leaf material or wood chips. But oftentimes when I want to plant directly into it, I'll make sure that in addition to leaf material, wood chips, compost, I make sure to top dress with topsoil as well. And the nice thing about that is you're building additional soil layers. That topsoil, that compost, that cardboard, it all stays in place and just decomposes. And the grass underneath gets smothered out and also decomposes and just composts in place. And then you're able to just kind of plant right on top of it. It buries your seed bank, so it's quite effective from stopping seeds from coming up. That being said, it doesn't kill the seed bank. So if you're then going to get in there with a shovel and plant a tree afterwards, you want to keep in mind that soil disturbance is going to bring seed to the surface. So you want to kind of keep an eye out for any weed seeds that might come with your disturbance of the soil afterwards. But a lot of times I will lay down that cardboard, top it with a couple inches of topsoil, and plant young plugs into it where I'm not actually breaking, the cardboard structure at all. And by the time those plugs have really rooted in on top, the cardboard is then kind of, decomposing, and they can then root down below, and I never actually bring that lower soil to the surface. Smothering is my go-to way for killing lawn. It's also quite effective for, clearing out some other plants that you might not want. It works well for low-growing invasive species, things like goutweed or stilt grass. It can be quite effective for, garlic mustard is one that was popping into my head, but what I'm thinking is poison ivy. If you want to kind of clear out some poison ivy, smothering is quite nice. I've never solarized poison ivy. That seems kind of sketchy to me because of the aerosolization that solarizing can form, but it probably could be done. But I'm not so sure about it. Someone else might need to speak about that one.
All right. Great suggestions. Can you recommend an evergreen other than red cedar for the middle and upper Midwest for a small garden?
So what I'm going to say is that what really matters are your conditions, because I could recommend, 50 different plants for you that thrive in the shade, and if you've got full sun, my recommendations are useless to you. So I'd always say start with the conditions. What are your conditions? If you've got sunny, dry, if you've got shady, wet, and so forth. So with that in mind, I'll give you a couple of my favorite evergreens, but make sure that my recommendations match your conditions before you take them. I'll also say that I am very New England Northeast centric. I don't know the Midwest well, so I'm probably going to recommend some species that might not grow out your way, and I'm probably going to miss some species that might be in your area that I simply don't know. So with all those caveats, the Cultivating fontenaceana is a wonderful shade-tolerant, broad-leafed evergreen species. Doesn't get too tall, kind of weeps over in an almost waterfall-like effect, and is very happy anywhere from shady dry to shady wet. Great species. I'm a big fan of Rhododendron maximum. It's the great rosebay. Depending on conditions, that thing can range anywhere from 5 to 6 to 8 feet tall, up to, when it's really happy, it can do 15 to 18 to 25 feet tall. 25 being the upper extreme on a really, really old plant, but they can get quite tall even in cultivated settings when they're quite happy. Ilex opaca, the American holly, wonderful species for dry conditions, perfectly fine in full sun, perfectly fine in quite a bit of shade. In our area, you see a lot more of it in the coastal regions, but you do find it inland in kind of, glacial moraines and high dry ridge tops. I don't know how far west it extends, but I want to say it gets into the Midwest. Other hollies are good options as well. In terms of evergreen, Ilex glabra, the inkberry holly, is a great evergreen species. I'm a big fan of that one. Other good evergreens, there's always good options within your pines, your spruces. I love tamarack, or larch, depending on who you're talking to. It's the same plant, two different names, tamarack, larch, Larix laricina. It's a deciduous conifer, so it's not actually an evergreen, but it's a coniferous species that turns vibrant yellow in fall before dropping all its needles. Has some really cool, the cones when they're younger, this beautiful kind of strawberry pink color. Stretching out your evergreen request, but being a conifer, I like to sneak it in there. See if other ones come into mind. Those are my favorites, at least. Ones that are jumping right out at me.
Good suggestions. Did you mention using pokeweed, and if so, how?
I didn't mention using pokeweed, not that I can recall, at least. There are ways to use pokeweed. While we're on the topic, there's the poke sallet, which can be sometimes called salad, S-L-A-L-D, or sallet, S-A-L-L-E-T, is an edible species in the early season. Pokeweed berries are not at all edible. In fact, they're considered poisonous. But in the early season, the stems can be treated like a cooked green and can be quite tasty. And despite the fact that a lot of gardeners call it a weed, it is an important native annual species that is loved by both birds and flies and bees and a couple other guys. It's one of those plants that we kind of call a take it or leave it weed, as in if it's not causing us any trouble where it is, we leave it alone, let it grow, let it thrive. If it's in a place we don't want it, we say there's a plant out of place, we're going to call it a weed right there. And for the most part, for me, that means if it's right on the edge of the garden, on the trail side where maybe a kid will pick a berry, or it's just big enough where it's blocking the view to the rest of the garden, that's a take it spot. And if it's growing in the middle of it, I just let it grow and like it for that.
Good strategy. Can you recommend other native blueberry varieties that would be good for a home garden?
There's a lot of good varieties out there. So we've got Blue Ray here as one of our major ones. There's one that Maine, the University of Maine, developed called Patriot, which is quite a large berry, but unlike some of the other large berried ones, it's also still flavorful. There seems to be an issue in the kind of cultivation of edibles world where sometimes the goal is just to get bigger fruit, but you lose all your flavor and you get this big, beautiful, tasteless, say, blueberry or strawberry. This is really a big problem in the strawberry world. So Blue Ray, Blue Jay, Patriot, Jersey, Rubel, that's R-U-B-E-L, good options. There's a half-high one called North Sky, and another half-high one that just came out, I think, a couple years ago that I'm just trying out. I've never eaten it yet, but so far so good, called St. Cloud. What I would do is I'd recommend good sources, because oftentimes a good source will test these plants for you and not sell something that's flashy and not all that great. Fedco is a fantastic source for native edibles and non-native edibles and heirloom varieties and things like that. I'm also a big fan of Oiko's tree crops. They're quite good. Stark Brothers kind of hit or miss on. Sometimes they're really quite great, other times not so much, but they're definitely worth checking out. They're the ones that gave me all my sunchoke varieties. Someone at Stark Brothers really liked sunchokes, and they had something like 40 varieties available. And that was kind of like I was a kid in a candy shop trying to narrow my selection from 40 down to 2. But I pretty much if Fedco sells it, I am pretty comfortable saying it's likely a very good variety. They're a fantastic organization that if folks don't know, they ought to get to know them.
That's a really good tip. Aside from the walk that you illustrated today, how much of Norcross's 8,000 acres are accessible to the public?
So the 75 acres is what we kind of deem the public space that is open on a daily basis for you to just come and walk around and see, on your own, no appointments necessary. Outside of that 75 acres, we open up Norcross to, if you are a researcher looking to make use of our property, we are happy to grant access to the grander, scheme of Norcross. This is not something where you can just show up and expect access. But if you reach out to us and say, I'd like to research some of your old homestead structures, some of the Native American cultural stuff, and some of the bees or dragonflies or vernal pools or whatever, if you're a legitimate researcher or a professor or something to that extent, we are happy to grant access based on your needs and if we think it's something worth supporting. To the general public, what we offer, we're not doing this yet because it's a coronavirus concern, but once the world goes back to some semblance of normal, we offer cart tours of Norcross, not cart, but van tours. So the van tours will take you well outside of the 75 acres. They're mostly on this 2,800 acre largest contiguous unit, but they allow you to see the sort of things that you would never see on foot because, frankly, that's just too long of a walk. And you'll see things like Bear Hill, which is a big, beautiful hill that's literally bear on top, B-A-R-E, not B-E-A-R. And from there, you're able to see, I don't know how much of Norcross, many thousands of acres from the top of Bear Hill. We'll show you Tupper Hill, which was the first ever original land purchase, actually land gift that was given to Arthur Norcross. It was the 100 acres he started with before it eventually became 8,000 plus acres. You will see things like some of our bogs and our swamps and our we have canals out kind of out and about, which are not really working canals. They're just like a built canal space that opens up a different habitat, allows us to grow a lot of both pine barrens and wetland species. So there's ways to access the rest of it from the general public's point of view through these van tours. And if you're interested in the van tours, hop onto our website. As I said, we're not doing them yet because packing 15 people into a van during a viral epidemic seems like a pretty bad idea. But hopefully in the future we'll be able to offer those again, and we will be able to offer people the ability to see the out and abouts. If you are in the horticultural or wildlife refuge or some other kind of industry, and you've got, say, interns or young professionals that you think would benefit from seeing this site, feel free to reach out. We'd like people to interact with us more than we used to in the past, so we're happy to kind of make it work. But keep in mind, there's 8,000 acres and there's a whopping 7 employees here, so time is a stretch, and we're not going to be able to say yes to too many, but it doesn't hurt to reach out.
Very good. Thank you. Can partridge pea be planted in the fall, or do you have to wait for spring to seed that in?
It's actually best planted in the fall. You can sow partridge pea in the spring, and we sowed partridge pea last year in June with the thought that, we weren't sure if it was going to be able to produce flower and produce fruit with such a late sowing. Usually you sow it either first thing in the spring or you sow it in fall. But the ones we sowed in June, they didn't get very tall. They only got about probably 5 inches tall, but they went through flowering and into fruiting, and we've got new partridge peas, on site now because of it. So this, as we mentioned, is an annual species, but will be persistent on the landscape by constantly producing seed. They don't need a cold stratification, but they seem to benefit from it. Whereas the ones we sowed in fall, we had a larger, more consistent amount of germination than the ones we sowed in spring. That being said, we had easily enough germination from spring sowings that it's still worth doing if you miss your fall window and want to sow in spring. Frankly, if your ground was prepared, I think you could probably get away with a winter sowing and just sow it onto the snow, just so long as it's not like a crusty ice layer where it's just going to blow away on you. And it would probably just melt and fall into place and probably do you just fine.
Okay, very good. Which was the goldenrod that you cut back?
In my wet meadow, I've got a lot of Solidago rugosa. That's the roughleaf goldenrod. It's one of many native species, and it's probably the one that gives goldenrods their bad rap for being weedy. It's a very, very vigorous species. It's an important plant on the landscape, and one I actually recommend for really difficult areas. I think every highway median in New England should be coated in Solidago rugosa. But in my wet meadow, what I want to do is increase the diversity of different flowering forms as much as possible. So what that means is I go into that meadow with a weed whacker and I cut back pretty much as much of the Solidago rugosa that's growing in a thick enough patch where I can cut it back without cutting back other good things. And what that means is that the rest of the rugosa, of which there's still plenty in the meadow, is growing in areas where there's also bee balm and Joe Pye weed and ironweed and all this other good stuff in amongst it. And it's functioning quite nicely as a part of the wet meadow. What I don't want is entire patches of it where it's becoming kind of monoculturistic, and that's why I kind of maintain it to some extent. So it's an overly vigorous species in some cases, but still a useful one. My goal is not to remove it by any means, just to knock it back enough to keep my diversity as high as possible.
Good suggestion. Do you need to plant more than one rubus or more than one hazelnut for cross-pollination?
So the simple answer is, frankly, the simple answer is I've never bothered to because I've always planted more than one. I believe rubus are self-fertile. I would want to double check that though. This is another thing where I'm going to point you towards Fedco because they've got a whole how to grow sort of section of their website, and rubus is one of the many ones they do. I believe rubus is self-fertile, and you could get away with planting just one. That being said, who just wants a few raspberries? Plant a whole bunch of them. They're much tastier, and cross-pollination, even for self-fertile species, tends to result in higher fruit set, afterwards. And so for something like my blueberries, I'm always sure to plant, if I'm planting cultivars, I want to make sure to plant multiple cultivars so they can cross-pollinate, because 2 blueberries are genetically one plant. Or if you, one of the things I always also like to do is try and include natural species as well as your cultivars. Not only is that good from an ecological point of view, but the natural species is pretty much a surefire pollinator for just about any cultivar out there.
Okay. How do you manage aggressive wild blackberries in a little bluestem meadow?
Management on those, for us in the little bluestem meadow, the little bluestem has the competitive advantage over the wild blackberries because our meadows are just so sandy and dry, and little bluestem just thrives in that. And though the blackberries will grow in it, they're not as vigorous there as they would be in kind of richer, more moist soils. I think the best thing to do with blackberries is a regular mowing sort of treatment. And this is something where if you get yourself a bladed weed whacker, that can really be a very strategic tool about kind of hitting areas and not hitting the rest of the stuff. And I think, as I said, managing 75 acres, I don't have time to do a lot of, kind of small scale hand weeding. The bladed weed whackers have become a very, very, regularly used tool for me for managing things like, for me, I don't have blackberries to deal with in that manner, but that would be my go-to tool for it. The other thing that you could do is, an annual mowing on those, which will definitely help, and then probably a second sweep through, either with a mower that can be set high enough where you can kind of hit the blackberries. If you're hitting them in the early season before the little blue stem really kicks in, you can mow them repeatedly up until probably about July 1st, depending on the season, and that's where you can just check your little blue stem to see how high they are. And that can just keep knocking back those blackberries without bothering the little blue stem at all, really giving it the competitive advantage. Later in the season, you could then come in there with a weed whacker where you could really be strategic about hitting the blackberry without hitting the little blue stem. That being said, I always purposely make sure to leave some blackberries in certain areas that I mow every other year so that I can get second-year canes and get fruit off of them. Because even though they can be a bit overly vigorous and challenging to manage, eating blackberry fruits really does make up for a lot of the challenges because they are absolutely fantastic.
Very good. This spring, this listener converted a section of front lawn into a native pollinator garden and planted phlox plugs on 6.5, but they are not doing very well. It's a full sun spot. Any suggestions?
Depends a little bit on which phlox you planted. If it's anything but phlox, well, phlox subulata and phlox paniculata will do quite well in full sun. If it's a dry spot and full sun, phlox paniculata will not do well, but phlox subulata will. If you planted phlox stolonifera or phlox divaricata, those plants really prefer to be in the shade, and that could easily be the reason they're not doing so well. If you've got other kind of meadow species growing in the area, pretty much taller species that will eventually shade out that phlox, then all they really need to do is kind of hold on until the garden really grows up to size, and that little bit of extra shade that the taller plants will provide will really help the phlox, and it should kind of do quite a bit better for you. If your soils are particularly thin, top dressing of compost can really help something like phlox, paniculata to really kind of bulk up and do quite a bit better. But it really depends on the species you've got. That's the key here.
Okay, very good. And what are the sun requirements for the native Lismachia? And are they aggressive the way other Lismachias are?
Good question on both accounts. They're not very aggressive. They want full sun. I've seen Lismachia quadra, so there's quadriflora and quadrifolia. Quadrifolia is the one I showed you a picture of and the one I'd recommend. They can do a little bit of shade. I've seen them on kind of wetland or woodland edges. Lismachia terrestris really likes full sun. A little bit of shade's not a big deal, but as soon as you start getting into something you'd call part shade, they tend to kind of peter out. Terrestris, swab candles, is really quite beautiful. That one really needs moist soils as well as decent sun. Quadrifolia does not. It'll be fine in dry soils. It'll be fine in wet soils. It just needs some decent sunlight. A little bit of shade's not a big deal with that one. And they're nothing like purple loosestrife. They're a completely different plant altogether. They're a well-behaved native species. They're very good at growing in amongst other things. I've even got a patch of Lismachia quadrifolia that's growing in amongst Arctostaphylus uvarucii, the bearberry. And that's quite a low-growing plant, and it would peter out quite quickly if the Lismachia was vigorous enough to really shade it heavily, and it doesn't. The two grow together very nicely.
Oh, good combination. Okay, and our final question is, what size is the plant, and what size are the flowers on the gamma grass?
Okay, so gamma grass is another one that size-wise will depend a little bit on conditions. In the drier sites, a little bit shorter. In the wet sites, a little bit taller. Either way, it's a pretty tall grass. So dry sites, let me see. I've seen them stay as low as 2 feet, but that's probably the minimum size for them. They're going to always get bigger than that. In the wet sites, I've seen them get as high as, I think they've gotten up to 4 feet in the kind of more moist areas. So somewhere between 2 and 4 feet, depending on your conditions. They really do like full sun. A little bit of shade, no big deal, but again, nothing kind of falling into that part shade direction or any more. Flowers on them are, so each one of those, those vibrant kind of magenta flowers that you saw are probably, let me see, maybe about a ½ inch in length. But then you get, that's each individual one of those little flowers, and you'll get many of those kind of growing along that spike. That whole spike will be again, depending on the season and conditions, ranging between, I'd say, 4 and probably 6, maybe 8 inches, with multiple individual flowers kind of kicking in amongst that. And you've got both a male and a female flower that'll show off on that one. And they both kind of, they have a little bit of separation in time. So you get, kind of one bloom at one point and then a little bit later on a second bloom. And by a little bit later on, I mean, a couple days afterwards.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you, Dan. This has been a lovely stroll through the trails at Norcross and wonderful opportunity to get a glimpse of what you have growing at this marvelous sanctuary. So thank you for sharing your photographs and all of your wonderful plant insights with us.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Penny, and the rest of ELA for putting this together. ELA is a fantastic organization. I highly suggest you all look into becoming members if you're not already. If anyone has some questions that are in the tip of your tongue and are not coming out and they come to you as soon as we end this webinar, you've got access to my website there, and my website has a contact me feature, and I'm happy to talk to people additionally about anything involving plants.